History flows like a river. Tell us what happened today in history.
Today, 2,353 years ago, on May 22, BC, the Battle of Granicus, Alexander the Great defeated the Persian Empire. The Battle of Granicus was the first large-scale battle between Macedonian and Persian forces on the Granicus River, now Biga. K or Changchai River, during Alexander the Great Eastern Expedition in 334 BC. As the saying goes, 30 years of Hadong, 30 years of Hexi. Darius, Xerxes, the Persian kings, and others may not have dreamed that after 100 years of galloping across Greek territory, they had been given swords to the Greek descendants of the head, but they put bright knives and guns on the necks of their descendants. The Battle of the Granicus River began just as their descendants began to suffer from the baptism of the blade. When it comes to the Battle of the Granicus, we must first talk about King Alexander of Macedonia and his father. Macedonia is located in the northern part of the Greek peninsula, and civilization began later than other Greek city-states. During the Hippo War, Macedonia once fell under Persian rule. Macedonia grew stronger during the Peloponnesian War in Athens and Sparta for hegemony. It was at this time that Alexander's father, Philip, ascended the throne of Macedonia. It took Philip several years to unify Greece and plan an eastern expedition to Persia. But on the eve of the Eastern Expedition, Philip was murdered by an assassin in 336 BC. Because of a coup d'état. After Philip's death, Alexander ascended to the throne as King of Macedonia. Alexander was called Alexander III in Macedonian history. He studied from Aristotle, a Greek scholar, and learned everything about Greece. He also accompanied his father on the expedition and participated in part of the command of the campaign of Colonia. So even though he was only 20 when he came to power, he was already a talented and ambitious man. After Philip's death, Macedonian aristocrats rioted, and the tribes of the north and the Thebes of the south revolted one after another. Alexander suppressed them one by one. He was particularly cruel to the Bestor, razing the city and selling its inhabitants to slaves as a warning to other polis. On May 22, 334 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont Strait, now the Dardanelles Strait, into Asia Minor. Although Persia has 400 warships, it has not blocked the strait and missed the best opportunity to deter the enemy. Legend has it that when the army crossed the sea, Alexander personally took the helm on the flagship. When he passed the strait, he slaughtered a cow to sacrifice to the sea god and poured wine into the sea in a golden bowl for the sea goddess. It is also said that he was the first man in the army to ascend the Asian continent. At that time, he was dressed in clothes and ordered to erect altars at the same time as his departure from Europe and his landing in Asia, offering sacrifices to Zeus and Athena, who had blessed him with a safe landing. As soon as the sacrifice was over, Alexander marched rapidly towards the Granicus River. King Darius III of Persia heard that he ordered Governor Minon of Asia Minor to take command of the front line and attack Alexander. At the battle meeting, Meinong suggested putting the battlefield in a small subdivision, luring the enemy deep into the field, strengthening the walls and clearing the fields, setting fire to grain, grass, cities and remote enemies, and then cutting off their retreat and encircling and annihilating them. But the governors of the provinces of Asia Minor were unwilling to give up their territory and advocated a frontal attack on Alexander on the right bank of the Granicus River. The meeting finally accepted the views of the governors of the provinces. When the Macedonian army approached the riverbank, Persian troops were in a position on the eastern coast of the higher terrain, with about 20,000 cavalry lined up along the river. Behind the cavalry were more than tens of thousands of infantry, mostly Greek mercenaries. When Alexander led his troops to a point not far from the Granicus River, he received a report from the reconnaissance troop galloping back that the Persian army had been positioned on the other side of the river. So Alexander formed his troops into battle formations and stood on the shore to observe the enemy. The general Pamanu went forward and said, "Your Majesty, my opinion is that our army will camp right on this side of the river. I believe that because the enemy infantry is fewer than our army, we must not dare to camp near our army. Therefore, it is not difficult for our army to cross the river at dawn." Before the enemy is ready, our army can cross the river. According to the current situation, I think that if our army takes immediate action, it will inevitably run a great risk. Because our army can't cross the river on such a wide front. It can be seen that there are many places in the river where the water is very deep. Moreover, you can see that the river bank is very high, and some places are just like cliffs. If our army appears in order in front of the enemy in the most vulnerable evacuation formations, the enemy cavalry will attack me in a dense formations. Failure in the first battle will have serious consequences for the present and will be even more harmful to the overall situation of the war. But Alexander answered proudly, I must not let this river stand in the way. The Persians thought they were as good fighters as the Macedonians. It was just that they hadn't experienced anything to surprise them. Now let them learn about Macedonian courage. He immediately summoned generals and divided the army into 3 groups, the left, the middle and the right, to prepare for a strong attack across the river. On the eve of the attack, the 2 armies confronted each other across the river, motionless and silent. Suddenly, Alexander flew on his horse, swung his spear, and ordered the forward to attack. Then he led the left and right flanks, sounded the trumpet, shouted the slogan to the sky, and rushed bravely into the river. When the Bosnian army saw the situation, arrows and javelins rained like torrents, shooting overwhelmingly into the river. The Macedonian army fell in batches and rushed up in batches. Alexander took the lead and led his relatives into the enemy's front. First of all, he selected several Persian generals under his horse. Macedonian troops crossed the river one after another, and cavalry from both sides were fiercely hanged. Saddleback fighters, stumbling boxers, saddleback horses, dashing and galloping, fierce fighting, inextricable. The battle lasted several hours. Darius III's son-in-law and son-in-law were killed in the melee. Persian cavalry retreated and finally fled. The mercenary infantry squadron resisted tenaciously, but under the attack of the Macedonian army on all sides, all but 2,000 people were captured and killed. After the war, Alexander returned 2,000 Greek mercenaries captured by him to Macedonia as slaves, and sent 300 sets of Persian armor to Athens to present Athena, the god of war, with the following dedication, I present these prizes captured from Persian hands in Asia. Philip and Alexander, the son of all the Greeks except Spartans, offered their respects. Quote, the success of the first battle of the Eastern expedition greatly inspired Alexander and his army. Thereafter, the expeditionary army surged into the heart of the Persian Empire. Today, before 1682, on May 22, 337, the Roman Emperor Constantine passed away. Constantinus I Magnus, full name Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantine, February 27, 272 to May 22, 337, 1682, Roman Emperor 306 to 337 in power. From then on, as far as Christianity as we know it today, the founder was no longer Jesus Christ in the 1st century AD, but Constantine the Great in the 4th century AD. American scholar Marnes comments on Constantine's remodeling of Christianity. One night in 312, at Milvia Bridge near Rome, a worried Constantine was worried about the coming war the next day. When he looked at the starry sky, he suddenly saw 4 huge red crosses in the sky, accompanied by the words, depending on this, you will win a great victory. This far-reaching and illusory plot, which has been widely read by later generations, actually indicates that a far-reaching change in world history is about to take place. Constantine was born in Niš, Serbia, in 280 AD. He comes from a large family, but is said to be the illegitimate son of his father Constanus and his hotel maid. At that time, when Die Kelly first carried out the 4 emperors governance system, Constantine became the deputy of the Western Emperor Maximilian. The young Constantine soon grew up to be an important figure in the superstructure of the empire. He served in the former army of Emperor Die Kelly of the Eastern Empire, and rose to senior rank by his courage and ability in the war against Egypt and Persia. In 305, when Diocletian and Maximi abdicated, Constantine became emperor of the Western Empire. Constantine returned to him and went to war with his father in Britain and other places. In 306, Constantine died of illness, and Constantine succeeded in the army as emperor of the Western Empire. However, some generals of the empire refused to accept it, and civil war broke out. After 6 years of war, Constantine, in 312 AD, was said to have defeated the challenger Maxenti and unified the Western Empire under the protection of Christ in the aforementioned Battle of Milvia Bridge. At the same time, Licini also controlled the regime of the Eastern Empire, forming a situation of two emperors standing side by side. They worked closely in the early years, including the promulgation of the Milan Royal Decree in 313. But the ambition of reunifying the empire finally made them unable to bear fire and water. In 323, Constantine invaded and defeated Licini and reunited the Roman Empire. Constantine is a contradictory complex. He has strong physique and vigorous energy, but it is said that he is extremely weak and cowardly and has to use jewelry to cover himself up. In fact, he is a mild personality splitter. He was kind-hearted, but poisoned his capable biological son. He once carried out a benevolent policy to help the poor, but soon became the oppressor of the poor. He decreed that slave owners had the right to whip slaves to death and impose heavier penalties on slave fugitives. More importantly, he forbade Linong to flee. Stipulated that Linong and its descendants must be firmly attached to the land of their owners, and that the escaped Linong should be shackled and released to their original owners. This opened the forerunner of serfdom in the Middle Ages. In addition, he further entrenched handicraftsmen in their associations. He defined the industries of coinage, bread and slaughter as lifelong and hereditary, which also had a great influence on the city guild system in the Middle Ages. After Constantine unified the Roman Empire, he devoted himself to strengthening the autocratic power of the emperor himself. He abolished the four emperors co-rule system, divided his nephews and sons and ruled all over the country. Abolished the guards, replaced them with the palace guards directly controlled by the emperor, and reduced the strength of the frontier garrison. At the same time, he further deified the emperor himself. Since Octavian's time, imperial power has been strengthened and deified, and finally reached its peak in Constantine's time. Although the geographical position of Byzantium became more and more important with the expansion of the Roman Empire, it did not receive the attention it deserved in the Roman Empire era before Constantine. Constantine rebuilt and expanded Byzantium, and in 330 declared that the capital of Byzantium was moved to Constantinople. From then on, the city began its brilliant millennium history. Constantine's name was integrated with the city until 1453. As a result of all these measures, Constantine has been able to rank among the influential emperors in world history. But there is still a far-reaching change, which has made the development of human civilization for thousands of years marked by his brand, that is, Christianity. In the early period of the Roman Empire, the belief was polytheism, which synthesized many ancient Greek and Roman temples. The Romans were basically in a situation of freedom of belief. Among them, Christianity, which believes in monotheism, is very different. Early Christianity was mainly spread among the poor. Believers were equal, helpful and compassionate. They were persecuted many times by the Roman rulers because of their obvious sense of resistance, their lack of cooperation with the ruling class, their lack of military service and their disrespect for the old Roman gods. Early in the Nero era, young Christianity was persecuted for the first time in history, and then again in the mid-3rd century, in the era of Dixius 249–251 and Valerianus 253–260. By the time of Diocletian 284–305, the emperor who claimed to be the son of Jupiter, the old Roman god, naturally regarded Christianity as heresy, and Christianity was once again doomed. In the meantime, some emperors took a tolerant attitude towards Christianity. Christianity was still developing rapidly in the 1st and 3rd centuries. By the 3rd century, there were more than 6 million Christians and more than 1,800 churches in Rome. With the development of Christianity, the composition of Christians has also changed. Many big landlords, wealthy businessmen and officials, even the royal family, have joined Christianity. The rituals of Christianity have gradually become more complex, the doctrine has become more submissive to the ruling class, and the ruling class has begun to understand Christianity. That's what Christianity was like before Constantine. When Constantine began to believe in Christianity is still a mystery, but it is certain that he did not believe in Christ in his early years. Perhaps it was the bloodshed of the four fields that he had seen during his long campaign that gradually led him to the idea of guilt, and spiritually embraced the Christian Church, which seemed to be full of benevolent thoughts at that time. Perhaps it was his mother and wife who had exerted a subtle influence on him, because they were all devout believers. The most popular saying is the strange scene at the beginning of this article. Constantine won the Battle of Milvia Bridge under the enlightenment of the cross, and then converted to Christianity. In 313, Constantine and the Eastern Emperor Licini jointly promulgated the Milan Royal Decree, which gave Christianity legal status and returned the previously confiscated Christian churches and property. This is a major turning point in the development of Christianity. Constantine never made Christianity a state religion, but his policy was clearly to encourage its development. He promulgated decrees granting Christianity many privileges, such as the right of the church to receive inheritance and donations, the exemption of clergy from taxes and corvée, etc. During his reign, believing in Christianity became a shortcut to the promotion of high-ranking positions in the country. He also built many famous churches, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. After the Constantine era, the status of Christianity has been unshakable, and finally became the state religion of the Roman Empire in 392, and began the era of sole respect in the history of Western culture. Constantine's contribution to Christianity goes beyond that. At that time, Christianity had been divided into several major factions, among which the Orthodox Church advocated the Trinity of the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit, while the one represented by Bishop Arius of Alexandria denied the Trinity, believing that only the Holy Father was eternal, and this school also advocated that the Christians should live in poverty. To help the Church unify its doctrine and organization, Constantine convened the Bishops' Congress in Nicaea in 323, the first major religious gathering in Christian history. The Congress adopted the Nicene doctrine, upholding the Orthodox Church's Trinity as orthodoxy, denouncing Arius as heresy and removing Arius from the Church. In 337, Constantine was baptized on his deathbed and rose to the heavenly kingdom of his dreams as a Christian. Many people have argued that Christianity can develop into a world religion even without Constantine. The reason is that many Roman emperors before Constantine cruelly oppressed Christians, but it did not prevent the development of Christianity. This is obviously doubtful. Associated with Manichaeism, it has spread all over the world, has numerous devout believers, has been oppressed repeatedly without changing the trend of its development and growth, in the Roman Empire era has become an important opponent of Christianity. However, Manichaeism has not been able to acquire the status of national religion in important countries. On the contrary, it has been persecuted many times. After thousands of years of wandering, Manichaeism has finally disappeared on the historical stage of human civilization. Considering the role of the Nicene Congress, it can be predicted that Christianity might be fostered by an emperor in an era without Constantine, but Christianity at this time must bear the brand of this era, which is quite different from Christianity seen today. There have been countless outstanding emperors in the history of mankind, such as Alexander the Great, Charlemagne, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, Qin Shi Huang and so on, but they may have more destruction, insufficient construction, or the establishment of an empire for too short a time, or the impact of their achievements as limited to a few countries and regions, rather than Constantine, which has a long-term and worldwide impact. Omar I and King Ashoka had similar influences on Islam and Buddhism as Constantine had on Christianity, but after all, the influence of Islam and Buddhism on the course of human history could not be compared with Christianity. In fact, even in China, where few Christians live, many Christian gifts have been accepted unconsciously, such as the year of the AD, actually the year of Jesus Christ, Sunday, monogamy, Christmas, universal spirit, confession and gratitude, etc. To sum up, Constantine should be at the top of the list of emperors. 56 years ago today, the 22nd of May 1963, the Organization of African Unity was established. The heads of 31 African countries met in Addis Ababa from 22 to the 26th of May 1963, announced the establishment of the Organization of African Unity and adopted resolutions such as the Charter of the Organization of African Unity. The Charter of the Organization of African Unity, adopted at the meeting, declared, "We are determined to defend and consolidate the hard-won independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of our countries and to fight against neocolonialism in all its forms." The purpose of the Organization of African Unity is to promote the unity and solidarity of African countries, coordinate and strengthen their cooperation and efforts to improve the lives of African people, safeguard their sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence, eradicate all forms of colonialism on the African continent and promote international cooperation with respect for the Charter of the United Nations and the Declaration on Human Rights. The Charter stipulates that the Organization of African Unity has four main organs, namely, the State and Summit Conference, the Council of Ministers, the General Secretariat, and the Mediation, Reconciliation and Arbitration Commission. The Summit of Heads of State and Government is the supreme organ of the Organization of African Unity. The meeting meets at least once a year. Each member state has one vote, and all resolutions are decided by a two-thirds majority of the member states. The resolution on decolonization adopted by the conference decided to establish a special fund to provide the necessary practical and financial assistance to national liberation movements. The resolution called for a deadline for the independence of all African regions. The resolution designates the 25th of May 1963 as Africa Liberation Day. The resolution calls on all African countries to sever diplomatic and military relations with the governments of Portugal and South Africa and to effectively resist their foreign trade. First, prohibit the import of goods from these two countries. Second, African ports and airports are not open to their vessels and aircraft. 3. The two countries are prohibited from flying over the airspace of all African countries. The resolution on apartheid and racial discrimination condemned all forms of racial discrimination in Africa and the world. The meeting decided to set up a fund to provide financial assistance to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and called for the immediate release of Mandela, Sobukwe and all other South African political prisoners. On this day, President Richard Nixon arrives in Moscow for a summit with Soviet leaders. Although it was Nixon's first visit to the Soviet Union as president, he had visited Moscow once before as U.S. vice president. As Eisenhower's vice president, Nixon made frequent official trips abroad, including a 1959 trip to Moscow to tour the Soviet capital and to attend the U.S. Trade and Cultural Fair in Sokolniki Park. Soon after Vice President Nixon arrived in July 1959, he opened an informal debate with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev about the merits and disadvantages of their government's political and economic systems. Known as the Kitchen Debate because of a particularly heated exchange between Khrushchev and Nixon that occurred in the kitchen of a model U.S. home at the American Fair, the dialogue was a defining moment in the Cold War. Nixon's second visit to Moscow in May 1972, this time as president, was for a more conciliatory purpose. During a week of summit meetings with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and other Soviet officials, the United States and the USSR reached a number of agreements, including one that laid the groundwork for a joint space flight in 1975. On May 26, Nixon and Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty (SALT), the most significant of the agreements reached during the summit. The treaty limited the United States and the USSR to 200 anti-ballistic missiles each, which were to be divided between two defensive systems. President Nixon returned to the United States on May 30. After 150 years apart, Marxist South Yemen and conservative North Yemen are unified as the Republic of Yemen. Ali Abdullah, president of North Yemen, became the new country's president, and Ali Salam al-B, leader of the South Yemeni Socialist Party, vice president. The first free elections were held in 1993. Situated at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen was divided between the British and the Ottomans in the mid-19th century. The Turks were expelled from the north in 1918, but the British continued to dominate the south until 1967, when the Arab world's first and only Marxist state, the People's Republic of South Yemen, was established. The unification of Yemen in 1990 did not go as smoothly as hoped. Economic troubles in 1991 brought Yemen to the brink of collapse, and a civil war in 1994 between southern secessionists and Yemen's northern-based government temporarily dissolved the Yemeni Union. Free elections resumed in 1997.